The most dangerous employee in any company is usually the quiet woman nobody notices until the systems stop working. Snow drifted slowly across lower Manhattan, while blue winter light reflected against the towering glass exterior of Nexera Cloud Systems overlooking the Hudson River. Inside the 46th-floor executive auditorium, nearly 700 employees filled the rows of black leather seating beneath massive presentation screens glowing with quarterly revenue projections and restructuring announcements. The annual all-hands meeting always felt more theatrical than operational. Executive branding videos, artificial applause, leadership speeches designed to sound visionary, while quietly disguising layoffs behind words like modernization and strategic evolution. I sat near the front beside the infrastructure leadership teams with a slim silver laptop resting closed across my lap, while cold white stage lighting reflected softly against the polished auditorium floor. Around me, younger engineering managers whispered quietly while executives prepared backstage for the final restructuring presentation. 19 years inside Nexera Cloud Systems had taught me something most companies never understand until disaster arrives. The people keeping infrastructure alive are rarely the loudest voices in the building. Usually they are the ones nobody bothers thanking because stable systems make executives comfortable enough to forget how fragile everything really is. Above the auditorium stage, giant screens displayed the slogan, "Reinventing the Future Together," while dramatic electronic music echoed softly through the crowded room. Typical corporate performance. Nearby employees checked phones discreetly beneath dim lighting while human resources staff moved carefully through the aisles carrying printed restructuring packets inside black leather folders. Across the stage, Chief Technology Officer Ryan Mercer adjusted his dark navy suit jacket, while smiling confidently toward the audience beneath the bright executive lighting. 42 years old. Aggressively ambitious. Brilliant with investor presentations. Completely uninterested in understanding the infrastructure beneath the systems he managed publicly. Ryan spent the past year positioning himself as the face of Nexera's modernization strategy, while quietly removing older leadership he viewed as outdated. Unfortunately for him, identity infrastructure is not something you replace casually between quarterly reports. It is the invisible architecture protecting every employee credential, client authentication system, cloud authorization layer, and enterprise continuity protocol across the entire company. And I built most of it personally after the cyber attack that nearly destroyed Nexera almost 2 decades earlier. Ryan stepped toward the center of the stage while applause rolled politely through the auditorium beneath the glowing presentation screens. "This company was built through innovation," he announced confidently. "But maintaining innovation requires difficult decisions." There it was. The language executives use when preparing to publicly sacrifice people for branding optics. Beside me, one of the younger infrastructure engineers shifted uncomfortably in his seat while glancing toward my direction. He already knew. Engineering teams always know before official announcements arrive, because technical departments hear panic long before executives hear consequences. Ryan continued speaking while slides behind him displayed phrases like operational streamlining and infrastructure modernization against animated skyline graphics. "As part of Nexera's transition into a new era of cloud scalability," he said smoothly, "we are restructuring several legacy leadership divisions effective immediately." The auditorium became quieter now. Employees stopped checking phones. Human resources staff stood near the walls beneath dim aisle lighting holding those black folders more tightly. Then Ryan looked directly toward me beneath the bright stage lights in front of the entire company. "Elaine Whitmore's role as Senior Identity Infrastructure Director has been eliminated effective today." Silence swallowed the auditorium instantly. Not shock exactly. More like discomfort. The kind people feel when something private becomes humiliating publicly. Ryan smiled politely, while human resources approached my row carrying a termination packet and temporary exit credentials. 700 employees watching. 19 years reduced to theater. Around me, engineers stared downward at their laptops while executive leadership remained carefully expressionless beneath the stage lighting. Ryan continued speaking casually, as if discussing budget adjustments instead of dismantling the identity infrastructure continuity chain, protecting the entire corporation. "Nexera appreciates Elaine's years of service as we move toward a younger and more agile operational structure." Younger and more agile. Interesting phrase considering half the executives in this auditorium still needed assistance resetting multi-factor authentication permissions every quarter. I accepted the black folder calmly, while snow drifted beyond the towering Manhattan windows behind the stage. No anger. No scene. People expecting emotional collapse from older women usually misunderstand where real authority comes from. Quiet competence frightens organizations far more than emotional reactions ever will. I stood slowly beneath the cold auditorium lighting, while 700 employees watched in total silence. Ryan offered the audience another confident smile before preparing to continue the presentation. Then I asked one simple question that immediately changed the atmosphere inside the room. Who currently holds root domain continuity authority for the enterprise identity infrastructure? Ryan blinked once beneath the stage lights. Around the auditorium, several senior engineers suddenly looked up sharply from their laptops. Human resources stopped moving entirely. The silence after my question felt heavier now. Different somehow. Because for the first time during the entire meeting, the technical people inside the room realized executive leadership might not fully understand what they had just done. Snow covered the streets around Nexra Cloud Systems the following morning while freezing wind pushed against the towering glass headquarters overlooking the gray Hudson River beneath heavy February clouds. Inside the operations center 3 floors below executive leadership, exhausted engineers stared silently at authentication dashboards glowing red across massive monitor walls, while support tickets multiplied faster than teams could respond. Employees throughout the company struggled to access internal systems. Password resets failed intermittently. Executive credentials expired unexpectedly during financial review meetings. Cloud deployment environments stalled beneath frozen authorization chains nobody seemed capable of restoring. Around 7:30 that morning, Ryan Mercer entered the emergency infrastructure room beneath cold fluorescent lighting with 2 vice presidents following closely behind him carrying legal folders and untouched coffee cups. The confident executive energy from the all-hands meeting had disappeared completely now. Nobody smiled anymore. Nobody discussed modernization strategy or operational agility. Technical reality had finally replaced presentation language. I need solutions, Ryan demanded sharply while engineers reviewed scrolling authentication logs across enormous dashboard monitors. One senior identity architect turned slowly from his workstation beneath the blue monitor glow. We told leadership the continuity authority chain required verified succession validation before termination protocols. Ryan folded his arms tightly, then bypassed the chain manually. Again, silence filled the room because everyone present understood something Ryan still refused to accept. The continuity architecture was intentionally designed to prevent exactly that kind of executive override after the cyberattack 19 years earlier. Unauthorized leadership interference triggered automatic stabilization protocols across the domain governance structure. In other words, the system viewed Ryan himself as the operational risk. Meanwhile, across the Hudson River, pale winter sunlight reflected softly across my apartment windows while I reviewed old architecture notebooks beside a warm cup of untouched tea. Every diagram spread across my dining table represented nearly 2 decades protecting Nexra from the kind of executive arrogance now destroying operational continuity from inside the company itself. My phone continued vibrating steadily throughout the morning. Former engineers, security managers, one terrified infrastructure vice president. Everyone asking versions of the same question now. How bad can this become? I answered honestly every time. Identity continuity instability spreads exponentially once trust propagation fails. Technical people understood immediately. Executives usually did not until clients became involved. Around noon, the first Fortune 500 customer formally contacted Nexra regarding delayed authentication responses inside a logistics management portal supporting several East Coast distribution hubs. By 2 o'clock, another enterprise client reported compliance reporting instability connected to cloud identity verification delays. Suddenly, the problem no longer involved internal inconvenience. Revenue exposure entered the room. Across Manhattan, board members began arriving at Nexra headquarters beneath heavy snowfall, while legal teams rushed between conference rooms carrying governance documents and operational risk assessments. Inside the executive war room overlooking the storm-covered skyline, one board member finally asked the question nobody wanted answered. Who approved public termination before continuity transfer validation? Ryan Mercer remained silent for nearly 5 seconds. In corporate environments, silence often reveals more than admissions ever could. Downstairs, exhausted engineers continued fighting system instability beneath rows of glowing authentication alerts, while snow fell heavily outside the giant glass windows surrounding the operations center. Then shortly after 4:30, another problem emerged. Nexra's executive VPN environment rejected elevated access credentials entirely during an investor preparation session involving quarterly financial disclosures. One younger engineer stared quietly at the failure logs before whispering beneath the hum of cooling systems and server fans, "The architecture is isolating unsecured authority pathways." Across the room, nobody spoke afterward because they finally understood the terrifying truth hidden beneath 19 years of invisible infrastructure maintenance. Elaine Whitmore did not simply build the system. She taught it how to survive leadership failure. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere inside Nexra Cloud Systems no longer resembled a modern technology company. It felt more like a collapsing airport during a winter emergency. Employees crowded help desk stations beneath cold white lighting, while exhausted infrastructure teams moved between departments carrying temporary access badges, printed authorization sheets, and emergency recovery laptops. Inside conference rooms overlooking the frozen Manhattan skyline, executives argued constantly beneath glowing dashboard projections showing operational instability spreading across enterprise environments hour by hour. Authentication latency continued escalating across internal systems, while cloud authorization failures delayed multiple client deployments scheduled for the quarter's largest infrastructure expansion cycle. The younger engineers looked terrified now. The older ones looked resigned. They remembered the cyberattack 19 years earlier that nearly destroyed Nexra before Elaine Whitmore rebuilt the entire identity continuity architecture almost from scratch. Back then, the company respected technical experience because survival demanded humility. But success changes corporations. Once systems become stable long enough, executives eventually convince themselves stability happens automatically. Around 9 o'clock that morning, a board-led governance review officially began inside the primary executive conference suite overlooking the Hudson River. Ryan Mercer sat at the center of the polished walnut table beneath recessed lighting, while compliance officers reviewed continuity governance documents projected across massive digital screens. According to infrastructure succession protocols, one legal advisor explained carefully, root continuity authority required formal dual validation reassignment before executive termination procedures. Ryan rubbed his forehead impatiently. Then why was the process not automated? One older board member looked directly toward him across the silent room. Because Elaine Whitmore designed the architecture after leadership ignored security warnings during the cyber attack. Again, silence settled across the conference suite. The same uncomfortable silence that always appears when executives realize institutional memory belonged to the person they publicly humiliated days earlier. Meanwhile, across the river, snow melted slowly against the sidewalks outside my apartment building while weak winter sunlight reflected across the Hudson beneath gray afternoon clouds. I spent most of the morning organizing archived infrastructure documentation into secured storage containers, while quiet jazz played softly through the apartment. Funny how corporations erase people publicly but still depend completely on their invisible labor privately. Around noon, one former engineer named Caleb arrived unexpectedly carrying a cardboard tray of coffee cups and exhaustion beneath his eyes. 29 years old. Brilliant systems analyst. One of the few younger engineers who actually listened instead of performing intelligence theatrically for executives. They still think this is temporary, he admitted quietly while sitting across from me beside the apartment windows. I nodded slowly, because they never understood what continuity architecture protects. Caleb stared toward the Manhattan skyline across the river before speaking again. The executive teams are blaming documentation gaps. That almost made me laugh. Corporations always blame documentation when the real problem is arrogance. The architecture documentation existed. Ryan Mercer simply never bothered reading systems designed before his arrival, because executives obsessed with reinvention usually view history as inconvenience instead of protection. By late afternoon, Nexra's operational problems finally became visible outside the company itself. Two enterprise clients postponed expansion approvals citing identity continuity concerns, while internal investor communications faced additional delays due to executive authentication restrictions. Industry forums quietly began discussing possible governance instability inside Nexra Cloud Systems. The company still functioned publicly, but confidence was beginning to fracture privately. Around 6:30 that evening, Caleb prepared to leave before pausing near the apartment doorway beneath the warm hallway lighting. "There is something else," he said carefully. "Several competitors started calling senior infrastructure staff this afternoon." Of course they had. Corporate predators always circle wounded companies before executives even realize blood is visible. I remained calm while city lights slowly illuminated the snowy Manhattan skyline beyond the Hudson River outside my windows. "Good engineers follow stability," I answered quietly. Caleb looked back toward me silently for a moment before nodding once. Because deep down he already understood something Nexra's leadership still refused to accept. This crisis was never really about technology. It was about trust. And trust, once broken publicly, rarely returns quietly. Friday arrived beneath pale gray skies while freezing rain coated lower Manhattan in reflective sheets of icy water, beneath the towering glass skyline surrounding Nexra Cloud Systems headquarters. Inside the company, exhaustion had replaced panic. Employees moved more quietly now through dim hallways and crowded operations rooms beneath sleepless eyes and cold fluorescent lighting. Authentication failures continued disrupting internal workflows while emergency infrastructure teams worked nearly non-stop, attempting to stabilize continuity chains leadership never fully understood before dismantling them publicly. The biggest problem no longer involved technical outages alone. Confidence was collapsing.
Entreprise client délai d'approval.
Internal engineers questioned leadership competency privately. Investors demanded operational briefings every 6 hours. Around 8:15 that morning, Nexra's board assembled again inside the executive conference suite overlooking the rain-covered Hudson River, while legal advisors distributed updated governance exposure reports across the polished walnut table. Ryan Mercer looked older somehow after only 3 days. His sharp executive confidence had faded beneath dark circles and strained silence, while compliance officers reviewed additional continuity documentation projected across giant wall displays. The identity architecture continues isolating unsecured authority pathways automatically, one senior infrastructure consultant explained carefully. It was intentionally designed this way after the cyber attack. Another board member leaned forward slowly. "Meaning?" The consultant hesitated briefly beneath the cold recessed lighting. "Meaning the system trusts validated continuity authority more than current executive hierarchy." Nobody spoke afterward because everyone understood the implication immediately. Nexra's infrastructure viewed Elaine Whitmore as more operationally trustworthy than the leadership that fired her publicly. Meanwhile, across the Hudson River, I spent Friday morning walking slowly through Hoboken beneath freezing rain and crowded sidewalks, while Manhattan's skyline disappeared behind gray clouds across the river. For the first time in years, my phone remained silent for nearly 2 hours. Strange how quickly corporations stop demanding your attention once they no longer control your schedule. I stopped briefly inside a small waterfront cafe where warm lighting reflected across rain-covered windows, while commuters hurried past outside beneath umbrellas and winter coats. That was where the first recruitment call arrived. The number belonged to Vatron Dynamics, one of Nexra's largest enterprise cloud competitors headquartered in Boston. The voice on the line sounded calm and professional. "Mrs. Whitmore, we have followed the situation carefully this week." Of course they had. Every major infrastructure company in the country was watching Nexra unravel in real time. "We believe your operational expertise has been significantly underestimated." The recruiter continued carefully. "Interesting phrasing. Not sympathy. Recognition. Real technical organizations understand the difference immediately." By afternoon, 2 more competitors contacted me privately regarding advisory opportunities connected to enterprise identity governance architecture. Apparently humiliating the woman responsible for maintaining one of the most stable authentication infrastructures in the industry had become excellent recruiting material for everyone except Nexra itself. Back in Manhattan, meanwhile, another crisis emerged shortly after 3 o'clock. One of Nexra's largest healthcare logistics clients temporarily paused a multi-million-dollar expansion agreement, after authentication instability triggered compliance review, concerns involving secure operational access environments. Inside the executive war room beneath giant glowing dashboards and untouched food trays, panic finally returned completely. "This cannot spread publicly," one vice president muttered while staring at the suspended contract notification. But it already had. Industry analysts quietly discussed Nexra's governance problems across private enterprise forums, while recruiters contacted nervous engineers throughout the company. Technical departments sensed instability long before shareholders ever noticed it formally. Around 6 o'clock that evening, Ryan Mercer finally called me directly for the first time since the all-hands meeting. Outside my apartment windows, rain streaked softly across the Manhattan skyline while the Hudson River reflected cold city light beneath darkening skies. His voice sounded controlled but exhausted. "Elaine," he began carefully, "we need to discuss continuity restoration." There it was. Not apology. Not accountability. Just operational desperation disguised as professionalism. I remained quiet for several seconds while rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking the river. Then I answered calmly. "You publicly removed continuity leadership before understanding what continuity actually protected." Silence followed instantly because deep down Ryan Mercer finally understood the terrifying reality surrounding Nexra cloud systems. The infrastructure crisis destroying his company was not caused by sabotage. It was caused by arrogance. 3 months later, spring sunlight shimmered across the Hudson River, while ferries crossed slowly beneath the Manhattan skyline outside Vatron Dynamics headquarters in Jersey City. Winter had finally disappeared from the East Coast, melting the snow and gray exhaustion that once surrounded Nexra cloud systems during the worst operational collapse in the company's history. But some things had not recovered nearly as easily as the weather. Nexra still operated across Lower Manhattan beneath emergency governance oversight and investor pressure, after losing 2 major enterprise contracts, dozens of senior engineers, and most importantly, institutional trust. Across the river, however, stability looked very different now. Inside Vatron Dynamics, sunlight poured through towering glass conference rooms while infrastructure teams prepared enterprise continuity expansions under calm operational leadership. Nobody rushed through hallways in panic anymore. Nobody ignored engineers. Nobody treated continuity architecture like an outdated inconvenience standing in the way of executive branding campaigns. Funny how corporations suddenly rediscover humility after watching arrogance destroy millions of dollars publicly. I stood quietly near the windows overlooking the bright spring water, while morning light reflected softly across the polished floors of Vatron's executive strategy suite. Beyond the river, Manhattan looked peaceful again beneath blue skies and silver towers glowing in the distance. Beside me, Caleb reviewed infrastructure migration reports across a tablet, while several younger engineers finalized authentication continuity diagrams around the conference table behind us. 3 months earlier, he looked terrified inside Nexra's collapsing operations center. Now he looked focused, stable, respected. That difference mattered more than executives usually understand. Strong infrastructure teams do not stay where competence is humiliated publicly. "The final healthcare migration completed overnight," Caleb said quietly while setting the tablet onto the table beneath warm morning sunlight. "0 continuity failures." I nodded slowly while watching ferries move across the Hudson River below. Stability, quiet, predictable systems. Those things sound boring to executives chasing headlines and quarterly applause. But enterprise clients trust boring systems because boring systems protect billion-dollar operations from collapse. Across the room, one younger engineer laughed softly while another reviewed cloud continuity reports beneath glowing wall displays. Nobody performed intelligence theatrically here. Nobody interrupted experienced staff to sound visionary in front of investors. Vatron hired engineers to protect systems, not executive egos. Around noon, an industry article appeared quietly across several enterprise technology publications. Ryan Mercer officially resigned from Nexra Cloud Systems following governance investigations tied to infrastructure continuity failures and operational leadership negligence. Another executive would eventually replace him. Another branding campaign would eventually arrive. Corporations always believe changing faces repairs broken culture automatically. Usually it does not. Caleb glanced toward me carefully after reading the article notification on his tablet. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. I thought about the question honestly while sunlight reflected across the Hudson River outside the towering windows. Strange thing about revenge. People imagine it feels explosive, emotional, victorious. But real professional consequences usually arrive quietly. One decision, one public humiliation, one executive forgetting that invisible labor still holds entire companies together long after presentations end. "Mostly relieved," I answered softly, "because the system survived." And they had. That was the part nobody outside infrastructure departments truly understood. The continuity architecture never failed. The governance surrounding it did. Across the river, Manhattan shimmered beneath bright spring sunlight while ferries moved slowly across the water below the skyline. Somewhere inside another executive conference room, someone was probably preparing to remove an older technical employee they viewed as outdated. Somewhere else, another infrastructure engineer sat quietly maintaining systems nobody appreciated because everything still worked properly. And somewhere deep inside every modern corporation, invisible people continued protecting operational stability, while executives collected applause for results they barely understood. I turned away from the windows while younger engineers continued discussing continuity reports beneath warm conference room lighting. Calm voices. Stable systems. No panique. No emergency dashboards glowing red across sleepless operations centers anymore. Just quiet competence finally treated with the respect it deserved. Because in the end, Nexera cloud systems never collapsed because Elaine Whitmore revoked domain access. Nexera collapsed because leadership publicly humiliated the woman who knew how to protect the company from itself.